We got Dr. Braxton Hunter, pretty talented and well-known apologist, shared the stage with the William Lane Craigs to the Mike Laconas to all those guys. Jonathan Pritchett, Dr. Pritchett is here, and he is a New Testament guy, does a lot of stuff, a lot of podcasts, a lot of debates, so on and so forth.
You can go out of this room tonight and be a Christian apologist. Now, it may not be that you're able to give the answers, but you can be immediately when we're done here tonight, you can be an answer finder for people.
We need to stand up and tell men and more women, God is smarter than you. And there are consequences for all of these actions. So why don't you stop for a moment and think you don't know what's best for you compared to what God knows is best for you.
Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and along with me is
Jonathan Pritchett
and Chris Date. The head, I guess, of Rethinking Hell. Is that right? Are you the main muckety-muck in charge over there?
I think in terms of the 401k status, I am the president, but that wasn't always the case, and I'm not the founder. So I guess I would say I'm the public face of Rethinking Hell.
Yeah. Well, we're really excited to have you on. We've been big fans of yours for a long time, and there have been a couple of times where we have talked about doing a discussion, you and I together, on an issue that we disagree about. And I've always said, no, thank you, because when I do discussions and debates, I prefer to win those debates. Yeah. And no one wins against Chris Date.
Yeah, but as you know, as soon as I saw your debate with Matt Dillahunty, I texted you saying it's I who don't want to debate you. So
that's very kind of you.
I guess
this is gross.
I guess our respective fans will just have to be disappointed that we're never going to touch each other with a 10-foot pole and debate.
Yeah. Well, maybe depending on how it goes, we may press back and forth a little bit before this is done. But really, What we want to do first and foremost, in case people don't listen very long, is to say that there is a conference for Rethinking Hell coming up. And
both of us are speaking at it.
Obviously, the president of Rethinking Hell is going to be there, but Dr. Jonathan Pritchett, my partner in crime, is also going to be there. My understanding is that he's going to be there in the capacity of a fence sitter.
Yes.
So I'll just briefly explain that.
Too cowardly to pick a position. Is that where we're going?
Chris is, so Rethinking Hell. Many of the people that are involved with that ministry are people that take what is known as a conditional immortality view of the nature of hell, and I'll let Chris unpack that a little bit in just a moment. Those of you, probably many of you, because I think it's still probably the most common view among evangelicals in the United States, who take the view that that hell is just whether it's literal flames and fire or whether that's figurative, but it's some actual existence, that you will be conscious and tormented in some form or fashion forever, and that it will never end, billions and billions of years, and you're just getting started. If you take that view, that is called the traditionalist view, not to be confused with traditionalist soteriology, which is something else. And so Jonathan is a fence sitter between at least those two positions. Yes. And so that's going to be exciting. Tell us a little bit about that conference and when it's going to be, Chris.
Well, so first of all, if people want to check it out, they can go to rethinkinghellconference.com, and there's a list of the plenary speakers, including Dr. Pritchett and me. And there's
Marvin
also
Jones.
Marvin Jones. So he and Lindsay Brooks are the believers in eternal torment who are doing plenary speaking. You're the fence sitter. I'm the sole person convinced of conditionalism. Marvin Jones is from Louisiana College, I believe, yes. And Lindsay Brooks was one of the staff at apologetics.com radio several years ago, and he's a fantastic guy. He's been a breakout speaker at one of our conferences. And the theme is going to be hell and the gospel. And so each of us are going to be talking about some sort of relationship of our own choosing between the nature, duration of hell, and how, and its relationship to the gospel. So some breakout speakers and plenary speakers might be saying that it's really important to the gospel, that it be understood in a particular way. Others might be saying that, it doesn't affect the gospel, and that's why as Christians who hold to different sides of this view, we can we can still fellowship with one another, and so on and so forth. The relationship between hell and the gospel that each individual speaker will speak to is to each of those people individually. And the dates are going to be, I think, August 16th and 17th. It's a Friday and Saturday in Enid, Oklahoma, which I believe is about an hour and a half drive from Oklahoma City. And
that way,
will also
be
be for
church, right?
What's that?
Wade
Yes,
Burleson's church?
that's right.
Yeah, he's one of my heroes. I really like Wade. He's a very good man, and he does a lot of important contrarian kicking against the grain with the Southern Baptist Convention. So I really that has endeared him to me very much.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
Is that
he's
a
good guy.
personality trait that you think you share with him? Is that what that is?
Well, he is so much more congenial than I am, but he's a super nice guy, but he does raise a lot of issues that
Yeah.
could be unpopular. But
Sure.
When I saw that it was his church, I was like, yeah, that figures.
Yeah.
If it's in Oklahoma, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, that sounds really exciting. What else? Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Well,
about
he's got
that?
he has a recent book that I plugged.
Yeah.
One of the better why you should or shouldn't like Calvinism. There's so many of these hooray for Calvinism or Calvinism stinks books out there. I don't really recommend any of them, to be honest with you. They don't help. I mean, go consult commentaries and other things like that. But I thought this was good because it did raise a lot of issues that you don't normally find in like the Roger Olson or the Michael Horton types. I mean, some of overlap, sure, but raise some other outside of the box approaches to it, which I think is what you get with a Chris Date. And I was not familiar with the other guy, to not even recall his name at the moment. But
Chris can tell us. What's the other guy's name?
Yeah, well, so the book is called "Does God Predetermine the Eternal Destiny of Every Individual Human Being?" If people want to check it out, they can go to my Amazon authors page. It's amazon.com/author/Chris Date. And it's a two-view debate book with a guy named Gil Van Order Jr. I don't know anything about him, but he's representing a pretty standard, I think, Arminian answer to that question, and I'm representing a Calvinist one. And really, as I think Dr. Pritchett can attest to, my focus in my presentation, my side of the debate, was really more concerned with the issue of meticulous providence. So the notion that God foreordains everything that takes place in time. Because for me, if that's true, then it follows that he predestines, the eternal destiny of every individual human being. But I do talk about texts to that latter point as well. It's just the main topic is meticulous providence.
Yeah. Well, I need to go back and read that again. And you've got another book upcoming with Dale Tuggy. Is that right?
Yeah.
You had a debate with him, and I saw that debate. And I want to tell you, I thought it was really good. I think he was a formidable opponent, and I thought that for a position that I can't understand anyone holding. I thought that he did as good a job with it as I can imagine someone doing. But I think you did your typical.
I think you took it apart,
Yeah.
Especially by the Q&A. I thought that he did okay, like you said, for as good as you could do. And certainly when you do a debate, you want to debate somebody that's got a credential at or above your level, so it makes you look even better when you win. And I think you did win. Part of it for me, and he can't help this, was the whole young Ben Stein routine that he does when he speaks, from the Ferris Bueller. But I mean that's not something he can help. But I didn't find him all that engaging, and then his material, I don't think that he presented any compelling arguments for his position. It seemed very. It's the kind of argumentation you could get just from any layperson in those kinds of churches. I would think he didn't really go too much depth, in my opinion. So,
well, Chris, let me ask you a question about that. So I don't want to say anything negative about him as a person, or
he's a heretic,
or his performance there. But I do want to say that I think what some people don't understand as a debater, there are a couple of things that I've picked up, and I would think you would concur. Is, for one thing, and I don't mean this to sound, well, I'll just say it, is you don't get to believe whatever you want to believe. You have to believe what actually you think is true. And I think there are a number of people out there who hold particular pet doctrinal positions because it's comforting to them, or it's what they were raised with, or whatever. But if you're going to debate something, wouldn't you agree that you have to... You don't get to pick and choose. You have to really believe it, because you're going to have to go out there and defend it. And if you don't believe what you're saying yourself, I mean, it's a really tough spot to be in.
Well, so first of all, I'll be interested to hear sort of what the application to this particular debate is of that thought, and I'm interested in, I'd like you to share that in a minute. But by and large, I agree with you. The only caveat is that when I present a case and defend a case for the doctrine of conditional immortality, I defend a version that I think is going to be most compatible with my fellow evangelicals, who are all dualists. And I know that the issue of dualism versus physicalism, anthropological that is something that we might talk a little bit about today. But I am not a dualist. I'm what's called a non-reductive physicalist. But I know that is arguably an even harder pill to swallow for most evangelicals. And so I defend and use language of dualism, and I just sort of assume it in my case because I want people to know that conditionalism does not require any particular view of the intermediate state and of the human soul and stuff like that. So the point is just to say, I do think there is a degree to which you could defend a position you don't actually hold. For me, it's strategic. And it's not the main thing I'm defending, right? It's sort of a secondary issue that I'm trying to be strategic about. But then anyway, I'm interested to know where you're getting, what you're getting to. Yeah.
So for instance, we all have philosophical defeaters, right? We all have things that I don't know if this is the case, but if this is the case, then it would render the argument that you're bringing not necessarily true. But at the same time, here's a simpler example. I would like, and people might be bothered with my saying this, but I can't imagine why. I would like personally, as a human being in my finitude, I would like for something like evangelical universalism to be true. I would like to believe that's the case. But I don't get to just believe whatever I want to believe. If I'm going to have to just stand up and defend this with an opponent whose job is to stand over there and take apart what I'm saying, I have to believe what I actually think is the truth and that I can defend from scripture and philosophy and history or whatever else. So I guess I mean by that, there are a lot of people in the theological landscape and that we run into on social media that believe a number of things. And I think that when you're pressed into debating that and backing up what you're saying on stage, that's where I've experienced in my own personal life having to modify beliefs because I realized this isn't just something I can, I'll think about that tomorrow. No, tomorrow's the debate. You better figure this out.
One of the things I like what Chris is doing, this was, and you said so in the debate, but you said this was a little bit out of your wheelhouse. And then, of course, you've got your for reasons that escape me, your affinity to Reformed theology. No, I'm just kidding. and so you've got that book out. And I mean, there's people that I know, good friends of ours, who could take a page out of that playbook to diversify instead of being I won't say one-string banjo, but how about something like a one-trick pony? I love you, Leighton. No, I think it's really good that you're doing all of these other things, because here's one thing that Braxton tells me all the time: if you pick one central issue and you're wrong about that. Like, say your whole thing is prophecy, and you stake your flag on the eschatology, hill, and your view, whatever it is, pre-trib, post-trib, amillennial, premillennial, whatever, and you're wrong. But everything, your entire ministry is just that one issue, and you're wrong about it. It's kind of
your whole ministry would be wrong. Whereas if you debate, preach, teach widely, you'll probably be wrong about some things, but you'll be right broadly, hopefully. Yeah. But the other thing I was going to say about that debate, and I know we're kind of just meandering through topics here, but the other thing I was going to say about that debate is I don't think people realize the degree to which it should matter to the debater. Obviously, truth should be the most important thing, and having good content that demonstrates the truth. But audience perception is important in terms of reaching the people that we want to reach for the kingdom. And I think when watching that debate, again, not wanting to say anything negative about your opponent in terms of his person, I will say that I think you came across much more likable. And in that sense, I would suspect that the audience member would be more inclined to appreciate your case.
And I thought he was likable too. And I knew just from his posts afterwards, like, he did his best, and they were still, like, for what you said, a very hostile audience. I mean, those people you said were pretty amped up against your position for the majority of them. Not that they were rude to you, or they might have been, but that they were not a friendly crowd to your position. Is that right?
They were very much not a friendly crowd to my position. They were, however, extremely kind and respectful and friendly to me as a person. Yeah,
right. They weren't rude to you, when you walked into the church, right? Or,
no, Dr. Tuggy, I think, was probably the most rude to me. Yeah.
Oh wow.
No, I mean in the debate. I was talking to Braxton on the phone a couple of days ago, and I was explaining that I went in trying to be as absolutely kind and gentle in the debate as possible, and that especially in his rebuttal, it seemed like his claws started to come out, and for better or for worse, mine did as a result. And so I was a little bit taken aback by how aggressive and hostile he seemed to me at times. Now, you guys might have gotten a different impression. But that was mine.
I mean, after my debate in Houston with a couple of weird Calvinist, hyper Calvinist type guys,
yeah, good point.
Nothing phases me anymore. After you sit through that, and you're just like. So nobody is rude after that. Those
good point.
That was kind of a circus. But no, with people like Tucky, that's such an important debate because everyone who watches our channel and our students, and I know this gets a bad rap, but I'm pretty much a paleo orthodoxy, mere Christianity guy, which means I have a wide berth of ecumenicalism. For me, I can welcome it, probably more people than even you as brothers. But even for me, when you're going up against somebody like Dale Tuggy, that's even outside my, boundaries, of just mere orthodoxy. And so those kind of debates are important because we forget that those people are out there, especially in the apologetics arena. We always think about atheists, but we forget that there's pagans and people of other religions out there as well. Well, atheists and Islam get a lot of attention, but very few Mormon debates anymore. But you also have various types of Unitarian and Oneness Christian branches out there, and they're not getting any attention because evangelicals like to fight with one another over all of these secondary and tertiary issues. But anyway, I think what you're doing is important, and I really appreciated that. Now, as far as the Rethinking Hell, when I say that I'm a fence sitter,
we're really channel surfing topics.
Yes, but
here.
I'm trying to bring it back to what we're having him here for.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have Chris date on your program and then never get into the nitty gritty of hell.
Yeah.
Well, maybe one day, right? One day you can have me on and not talk about the topic of hell. But at this point in my ministry, that's kind of.
Well, I mean, we don't want to. We've kind of stopped talking about the whole Calvinism thing, so I don't want to talk about that.
I definitely don't want to talk about Calvinism with Chris Date. But I will.
I would maybe.
But I will say this.
Jonathan will,
yeah.
But I do want to say this. At some point before we're done, if you would like to, and if you don't, I'll just cut this part out of the thing. But if you would like to give your thoughts on your interaction with Leighton, I know you just did that with Sean Cole and Tyler Villa. Our audience heard Leighton's thoughts about that, and if you would like to balance
4 hours and 42 minutes of his thoughts on that.
No. They heard him on our show.
Oh, no. I was talking about after the Sean Cole thing. I looked at his YouTube. It said 4 hours and 4. I was like, nope.
I wanted to hear what he had to say, but when I saw it was that long, I thought, there's no way. But if you would like to at some point, feel free to talk a little bit about that because that's only fair.
Yeah, well, that's good. And if you guys ever want to have me on to go in a little more detail, we could talk about that. The only thing I think I want to say right now is just that, and I've said this, I think, on a couple of different shows since that debate with Leighton. I went in simply affirming meticulous providence, whatever the mechanics. And it didn't even occur to me until maybe halfway through the debate that Leighton was challenging not meticulous providence, but a specific, mechanism of meticulous providence. What he calls causal determinism, and that's the biggest, the most frustrating thing for me since the debate is that he sort of framed it as if this was a causal determinist and me defending causal determinism, and a libertarian free will person going head to head, when that was never my argument at all. I think there are all sorts of possible means, conceivable and otherwise, that God could meticulously foreordain all that takes place in time. And arguments for that kind of got pushed to the side because he kept repeating his arguments against and his objections to causal determinism. And so I wish if we could go back and do it again, my hope would be that we can make it clear from the outset, I'm not arguing for a particular means by which God foreordains everything that takes place in time, so that we can sort of focus on that and not...
Would you say that we are flattening things out?
Oh, come on. Now...
well, okay. Just to be clear, if you guys haven't listened to the episode,
we have. That's why I was teeing you up. That's me teeing you up. The thing is, we often in our camp, we often make a kind of a joke out of the fact that we're told we're flattening things out. Specifically, I think James White has criticized us for flattening things out, and so that's one thing they were punching back on the show was. You make a joke out of it if you like, but that's what we think you're doing.
Oh, right? I make plenty of jokes. I think I said of all the hot air they blew, they couldn't inflate that flat balloon. Isn't that what I said about it? I don't know what a fully orbed diamond-shaped non-flattened compatibilism across the 5 dimensions actually means. What is? But anyway, I'm just.
I was teeing Chris up, not you.
It's my show. No, man. But I want to get back to hell. I want to talk about hell.
Okay. And so to
you
segue.
Already said before.
To segue back into hell.
Okay.
Let's ask Chris, because I kind of gave what could be an oblique definition of the traditionalist eternal conscious suffering view a moment ago. So for those that may not be aware, we did 2 episodes on this last year about this time, but for those that may not be aware, let's hear it from the horse's mouth and let Chris tell us what conditional immortality is all about. Why is it fair or not fair to use that synonymous with annihilationism, and just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but before I do, I want to add just a little bit more flesh to the flesh that you put on the bones of the traditional view, because you couched it as some sort of eternal suffering, whether it's literal flames or not, and that's all true, but there's a fundamental aspect to that traditional view that you left out, which is that we're talking about, in the traditional view, we're talking about resurrected, physically alive, embodied human beings suffering for eternity. And that's important, and I'll get to why in a second, but that's important. We're not talking about, when you die, when an unbeliever dies, his soul goes to hell, and there it remains disembodied for eternity in flames. Right. That's not what we're talking about. These are,
that's not what Jesus
muscles.
Was talking about, yeah.
And we're talking about, what's that?
Well, in Matthew 25, I mean, there is a general resurrection of the dead, and some go on to eternal punishment, however you define that, and some go on to eternal life.
Right.
And I think a lot of N.T. Wright talks about this a lot, how Christians, especially in the West, have kind of punted on the new heavens and the new earth and the resurrection. It's just disembodied souls floating in heaven, and so I think sometimes we do think, yes, we'll have resurrection bodies. We'll actually think about 1 Corinthians 15, but then we'll let those and you see the memes of the people in hell, and they don't look like humans so much as they look like outlines of humans, kind of ghoulish, but it's more like what you say. They would look like us, muscle tissue, whatever. Maybe not
That's
blood,
right.
but
Well, I don't see any. I would expect there to be blood as well, but either way, it's embodied, it's physical. A disembodied conscious state, if such a state exists, is called the intermediate state for a reason. It's between death and resurrection, and it's after resurrection that the debate about hell begins. So that's the traditional view. It's physically alive people who are made immortal physically, so they can physically live forever in torment. Now, with that in mind,
or held in existence, right?
Well, I mean, so I don't distinguish between innate immortality and sort of God just keeping you alive forever, because immortal, at least biblically speaking, isn't about some sort of change to your ability to die. It's a statement of whether or not you do die.
Right.
And I think that we would all have to agree that even after God renders us immortal, whatever specifically that means, he could, if he wanted, and if it didn't violate his promises to us, he could zap us out of existence at any moment. So we still, even in our resurrection bodies, depend upon him for our existence.
Right. That's why you call it the gift. It speaks of the gift of immortality.
That's right, and that's the key. The difference, at least from my perspective, between that traditional view that I just described and the view that we at Rethinking Hell defend, which we call conditional immortality. Right. And by the way, that's not a new term. That stretches at least as far back to the early 19th century. In fact, that's the phrase that my view was known as all throughout the world in the 19th century. The word annihilationism, which we'll talk about in a moment, goes back a little bit further, but not a whole lot. So the main difference between these views is that whereas the traditional view says everybody gets immortality when they're resurrected from the dead, whether they're going to go on to live forever in the new heavens and new earth, or whether they're going to go live forever in hell, the conditional immortality view is immortality is a gift that is conditioned upon salvation. So that's why it's called conditional immortality. The opposite, the traditional view, and for that matter, universalism, would be unconditional immortality. Everybody gets immortality regardless of whether or not they meet any sort of condition. Now, the reason why it's called annihilationism sometimes is because if a conditionalist is a traditional dualist when it comes to human nature, meaning they believe that we have material bodies and immaterial souls, those dualists typically believe that those immaterial souls remain conscious between death and resurrection. And that includes many conditionalists. But conditionalists believe that that's only true of the first death. According to Matthew 10:28, Jesus says, "Don't fear man who can kill only the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear God who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." So dualist conditionalists believe that while the first death separates body and soul, and the soul remains conscious until the resurrection, in the second death, both body and soul are destroyed, so the whole person ends up gone forever, and that's why it's sometimes called annihilationism. But the reason why I prefer conditionalism is because it's annihilationism is kind of a myopic view. Conditionalism is a much bigger picture about life, about immortality, about salvation, about the cleansing of sin from the cosmos. It's a really big picture thing of which annihilationism is just a small part. So conditionalism is just. Go ahead.
Yeah, right there. Okay, so broader in scope and covering more ideas than just what happens.
What happens to the wicked in hell? Yeah,
right. But within that, so my memory's fuzzy, but I do remember in your debate with Phil Hernandez. Is that right? Fernandez.
Phil Fernandez.
Phil Fernandez. Okay. In your debate with him, you did. I think you used the phrase "a violent death," or something close to that.
That's right.
And so I was curious because some people get the impression that you have a Thanos finger snap at judgment and they're gone. They just turn into ash. Others will posit maybe a period of punishment that ends in a pretty gruesome death, drawing on the imagery of destruction in the Old Testament that is sometimes marshaled as text for this. That this is what happened to them, and you see, charred bones and everything else. It's or just the parish is utter, and just nothing left. Things like that. So, would you say there is a spectrum within your camp? And could you elaborate on kind of what that spectrum is and what are the bounds for that? Yeah.
So at one end of the spectrum, I think you have people like John Stackhouse. John Stackhouse was a professor at Regent College, I think, in Canada. Now he's at the other end of Canada at a different college, and he wrote the foreword to our first book, Rethinking Hell, and he wrote a contribution to our second book. He believes that punishment is, by definition, at least, okay, let me rephrase that. I think that for him, punishment is primarily a conscious experience. So in his view, the lost, when they are resurrected, are indeed punished for some period of time as a commensurate with their degree of guilt. So some longer than others, some more intensely than others, what have you. And then once they've paid that debt, then they face eternal punishment, which is death forever. Okay. Now, we at Rethinking Hell object to that for a number of reasons, and we can talk about why, but first let me lay out the spectrum. So that's one end. You have an indefinite amount of time that the risen wicked, indefinite, but for us, unknown how long it will be, they experience punishment for their sin, and then they die. At another end of the spectrum would be maybe like a Thanos finger snap type of thing, but they're also like non-violent conditionalists. I would think of Greg Boyd, for example, or maybe Christopher Marshall, who would say that the final death of the lost in hell is not like the death penalty so much as God sort of unplugging them from the source of life, which is God himself. And so it's more like they're being permitted to die, and it may not even be very violent or painful. I don't know. So you've got that end of the spectrum as well. I think where we at Rethinking Hell fall is somewhere in the middle. We believe that the punishment is truly death. If you say that people are punished in hell for a time, commensurate with their sin, well, then how do you, and this is our objection to people like John Stackhouse, how can you call that eternal punishment if it's only for a finite duration? We think punishment is indeed death, and that death, the privation of life goes on for eternity. That's why it's eternal punishment. And we don't think there's some sort of separate protracted punishment in hell, but we do think that the means by which this final death penalty can be brought about in hell can vary in terms of intensity and duration of pain. So let me give you an analogy. We have in earthly governments a variety of different means by which capital punishment is carried out. There are relatively, or at least seemingly, painless means like lethal injection.
Yeah,
and I
that's not
stress
painless.
seeming.
I don't want to get
What's
off on
that?
I said that's not exactly painless, but I don't want to get off on that topic.
That's why I said seemingly, right? A lot of people think it is, but scientists are discovering that's not quite the case.
Right.
And then there's like, electric chair, which is a little longer and more violent, and you've got shooting squad and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Each of these different means of capital punishment, they all involve varying degrees and durations of pain, but they all inflict the exact same penalty, and that penalty is death. And I think that that's where sort of the middle in the spectrum is, that it's genuinely this annihilation at the end, this destruction at the end, is truly a death penalty, and it's one that will probably, for many people, be violent and painful, and that pain may even last for a few moments, a few minutes, who knows, maybe even a few hours. Christ was on the cross for hours, right? But in all these cases, however much and however long the pain is, ultimately the penalty is death itself, and that's what it brings about, and that death lasts forever.
Right. Now, as far as the repay each one according to the works, the reap what you sow principle, executing punishment, Stackhouse seems to have a view, I think, that seems to make a little bit more out of that kind of biblical principle, whereas the intensity of the death, I don't know, I haven't really thought about that yet, because it seems like I would almost maybe, if I was to take that position, I might actually agree with Stackhouse, I think. Because on the traditional view in the spectrum, you have, everything from Dante to, eternal conscious depression. You're just sad because God's not around,
J.P. Holding called it like having only cold flat beer, warm flat beer forever.
Right. But you hear that from some of this eternal separation anxiety, right? Then you have, you're just swimming in lava and you won't die, and you're screaming in absolute horror for all eternity, and so you have that kind of spectrum. But then the people will say, yeah, but the intensity of whatever version of hell you believe in on the traditionalist view on that spectrum is commensurate with the amount of wickedness that you did in the body. So you get repaid according to your works. And so they would execute. They would see that as in the amount of intensity and the conscious torment that you would have. So I think there's something there that I need to probably, one of those other little things I need to check the box. I'm still waiting to hear Marvin Jones's presentation, because he's going to be responding to Fudge on the early church fathers, which I think is because he's also a patristic scholar. So that's going to be interesting. But I think the repay according to the works thing is one of the things I need to work out on both sides. Because it's kind of weird, because when I say I'm a fence sitter, I think I'm sitting somewhere on the fence between the Stackhouse view you mentioned, and then somewhere between the probably the middle of the road between swimming in lava, end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, except you never die like Belloc, you just melt off your face for all eternity. Somewhere between there and then the sadness.
You're kind of swimming in lava.
You've got one toe dipped in the lava.
Right. Yeah. The lady from What Dreams May Come, that kind of somewhere in there. So I've got, and But here's the thing. One of the things that I'm going to be stressing is give people room to think, because I think that these guys, and I still haven't read everything that you've ever written, so I'm still on
How dare you?
I know. Hey, I read a book and gave you a quote. That's good enough.
Yeah, fair enough.
But so I still got things that I want to. But there was enough there with your podcast, your books, because you're really the guy that got me to thinking to rethink.
Oh boy,
I know. I had to throw that in. to rethink what I thought about hell, because I just kind of accepted the traditionalist view and moved on with it, just because I'm a big fan of tradition anyway. But then when I was, I think it was Glenn Peoples also did a thing on the early church fathers, and I got, well, I mean that's interesting, because I'm the first 5 centuries. Anything else is fair game. But the fact that there was communities there. And then I think Athanasius was that's a big one for me.
Well, that is if we conditionalists are right that he seemed to gravitate in that direction, and on the incarnation of the word, Athanasius sounds very much like a conditionalist. Right. Yeah. But even if you don't think of Athanasius and Irenaeus and Ignatius and Clement, at the very least, even if you were to dispute the conditionalist qualifications of all those guys, everybody agrees that Arnobius was a conditionalist, and he was before Augustine. And yeah, he's got some questionable positions because he was more of a philosopher than he was a theologian. But nevertheless, he is a respected church father and had a community of people that followed him. And that you didn't have people passing anathemas in councils against conditionalism.
Right.
So apparently the early church was okay with the diversity.
Right. And they talked like it. Now, the argument against it is, well, those church fathers, Clement and Athanasius, they just use biblical language so that you can't cite. That's the argument I've heard from the other camp against y'all's use of those fathers, and that to me falls flat. So I'm not buying that. I'm not buying what they're selling on that.
Let me pick up on that just for a very brief moment. It's funny, it's ironic that you said that, because it's typically we conditionalists who are having to say precisely what you just said in response to traditionalists. Because typically what traditionalists will do is they'll cite Polycarp in his martyrdom saying, referring to eternal fire, or Irenaeus referring to eternal fire, or worm not dying and fire not being quenched, or Augustine talking about eternal punishment. And they'll say, look, all these church fathers, they use these terms, so clearly they must have been traditionalists. Well, no, it's the very text of the scriptures that they're using that we're debating the meaning of.
Right.
But what's interesting about Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, Athanasius the Great, and Clement of Rome, what's interesting about them and others is that when they go beyond biblical language and they start using language of their own making, they very much sound like conditionalists. And I'll give you one example. Irenaeus of Lyon, and against heresies, he talks about how God grants continuance and length of days forever and ever to those who are saved, and he compares it to how God keeps the sun in existence for long-lasting periods of time. And he says God gives continuance and length of days forever and ever to the saved, but the lost deprive themselves of continuance and length of days forever and ever. Now, in using that language, Irenaeus is not using biblical language.
Right.
So that gives us a little bit more clarity into how he understands the biblical language when he does use it.
Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to the cover. My wife is looking forward to meeting you because she's
it's gonna be a big letdown for her.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to go to dinner with you and Star at least once. Is your wife gonna be there?
No, she doesn't typically come to the con. She said she's willing to if we need volunteers or something like that. So she may be out. Probably not.
Oh, okay. Well, my wife's coming because she's into this. She was on board. She listened to you. She listened to Steve Gregg, and even though Steve Gregg formally doesn't pick a position, she was convinced.
She's like Steve Gregg's wife. I knew who Chris Date was already, but when I went through Steve Gregg's whole New Testament and a bunch of the Old Testament verse by verse study, one day I got bored with that and looked for Steve Gregg on other things, and he was on Rethinking Hell, and he was telling, I think it was there that he was talking about how he went on a date with his current wife, Dana, and he said something. She had always been bothered by the traditional view of hell, and so he explained, well, there are other options. And when he explained that to her, he said, she said, you had me at hell. but yeah. So okay. So we're excited about the conference. We're excited for people to learn more about conditionalism. Let's be clear to listeners, if they go to that conference, what they're going to get is a series of lectures or presentations. There's going to be a couple of traditionalists, I think, right?
Yeah, 2.
And then there's going to be you on the other end, and then the fence sitter, Jonathan Pritchett, in the middle, right?
Right. But I won't
Yes.
be fence sitting for universalism.
He's got, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We don't have any universalists at this conference, although we have had them at other conferences, because we do think it's a conversation between 3 views of hell and not just 2.
Right.
But just keep in mind the examples that you just listed, those are only the plenary speakers. We also have a breakout session, and that also has a diversity of views represented.
Yeah.
Cool.
So,
Well,
for example,
go ahead.
for example, you guys might be familiar with philosopher Jim Spiegel. He just recently published a book in favor of conditionalism, and he's going to be one of the breakout speakers. But then on the other, and he's a conditionalist. In fact, he was a plenary speaker at 1 or 2 of our previous conferences. But then we've also got a breakout speaker named Zachary Manis, who was on the Rethinking Hell podcast a couple of months ago, and he's a traditionalist. But he's a super friendly guy, and he's going to be taking up a real good challenge. I published in the McMaster Journal of Theology and Ministry several months ago, arguing that the atoning work of Christ is most compatible with the conditional view as opposed to the traditionalist view. And Zach and a co-author are going to be pushing back on that challenge. So the diversity is not just in the plenary presentations; it's also in the breakout session.
Yeah. So that's good. That's what I like. Sadly, and we've spoken about this just back and forth. Trinity is one of those institutions where our doctrinal statement is pretty open as far as kind of a mere Christianity. We're not, we don't push cessationism or continuationism or Reformed theology or most of that stuff, complementarian, egalitarian, all that stuff's fair game here at Trinity, and including this issue. But there are a lot of seminaries that really have a problem with your view, and within the ones that have a problem, some would say, well, it's very concerning, and then others it's heresy. And so, once and for all, give us a reason why it's not heretical to have your view, and what you hope to accomplish as far as within the field of. Is there any good news on that front that it's becoming more acceptable to at least acknowledge it as a permissible view, or is it still just kind of where it's been for the past 30 years?
Okay, so let me address the second question first. It does seem to me as if the tent is widening, as it were. There are still plenty of seminaries at which I can't teach or even learn, plenty of churches at which I can't teach or even be a member, ministries I can't serve at. Those things all still exist, and I don't see those necessarily reducing in number yet. But on the ground, from the grassroots perspective, and in the pastorate, churches, I see room being made and progress being made, and that's really encouraging. I'm reluctant, however, to count my chickens, before they've hatched, because, as I've often said, there was an explosion of conditionalist literature and support in the 19th century, both in America and in Europe. And there were conditionalists at that time who thought the traditional view was on the verge of collapse, and they had all the signs pointing in that direction, and yet it didn't, collapse, and the conditionalist view pretty much went back into obscurity. So I'm hopeful, and But I think that what it's really going to take to tip the scales to a point where they're never going to go back, it's going to take people that are currently quiet about their belief in, or at least their lean toward, conditionalism. They're currently being quiet about it because they don't want to lose their livelihoods. And I totally get it. I've got 4 kids and a wife, and I don't know what I would do if I lost my job. That's one of the reasons I'm thankful I work in a secular world, is I can do whatever I want on theology and not worry about losing my job. Right. So I think it's going to take some people that are in positions of prominence where currently they're keeping silent, coming out of the proverbial closet on this topic, being willing to throw their support behind it, even if it means them losing their jobs and hopefully finding jobs at other institutions. Right. So that the world of Christian academia and the Christian pastorate, they'll realize they can't continue to close doors to conditionalists because they're going to end up closing their doors to too many people and too prestigious of people.
Yeah, and you say they need to come out of the closet while you are physically in a closet right now.
I am.
My standard is no one in the first 5 centuries, no one in the first 4 ecumenical councils, which is what all of Christendom, the Vincentian canon type of thing. None of them condemned it. I don't count the 5th, so even if you want to throw Origen under the bus and that form of universalism, which I know there's a debate about that too, it doesn't matter because I only count the first 4. So it's not heresy to me, and it's perfectly permissible. But
we're going to have to close this down pretty quickly. Go ahead. Yeah.
Can I answer the first question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the first question was, for once and for all, why is it a heresy? First of all,
why is it not a heresy?
Or why is it not a heresy? Yeah. Did I say why is it a heresy?
Yeah.
I meant not. So first of all, people can go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com, and just look for Rethinking Hell. And one of the videos is a video that I made called, is conditionalism an acceptable view or something like that. So if people want more detail, they can go to that. But basically, to sum it up, it's got a rich history, at least in the first several centuries of the church. So it's not novel. That's important. Number 2, it's not condemned by any of the ecumenical councils, as you just mentioned, and that's important. Even when diversity was known about, you didn't see people condemning one another for it. And then I'll just add one more thing. It doesn't touch on any of the essentials of the faith. So, most conservative evangelicals, I think, would say I'm orthodox on virtually every other doctrine. In fact, I'm more conservative than a lot of evangelicals. I'm a young earth creationist. I believe in inerrancy and so forth. So no matter how conservative of an evangelical you are, you can hold all the essentials of the faith, the Trinity, the deity of Christ, salvation by faith alone, the future resurrection of the dead, the future return of Christ, all this stuff, and still believe in conditionalism and have it be consistent with that. Penal substitution. It's also, incidentally, every single debatable view within Christianity, all sides of those debates are reflected in the conditionalist community. Cessationism, continuationism, pre-mill, post-mill, amill, etc. So it doesn't touch on the essentials. It's got a rich history. It's never been condemned by any ecumenical councils. And every debatable view within Christianity is reflected within the conditionalist community as well. I cannot think of any legitimate reason. The only thing I think anybody can press into service in arguing that it's heresy are those who would say that it requires you to believe that in the death of Christ, the Trinity became a binity, or that the hypostatic union was violated. And we could talk about that another time if you want, but suffice it to say, no, those aren't things that conditionalists actually believe. And I argue they're not logical entailments of our view. So as far as I can tell, there's no reason whatsoever for thinking that it violates any of the essentials of the faith.
All right, man. Well, quick, before we go, name your website again. Any books you want to plug and your podcast you want to plug for our audience.
Sure. The website and podcast is rethinkinghell.com. We're also in the iTunes marketplace. The conference information is at rethinkinghellconference.com. And for listeners who can't make it to Enid, Oklahoma, there's a online viewing, like a live streaming option as well. August 16th, 17th. I hope people check it out. Books, again, just go to my Amazon author page, amazon.com/author/Chris Date. I've got the Calvinism book, but then I've also got the 2 books on the topic of hell that I've edited called Rethinking Hell and A Consuming Passion. People can also check out my academia.edu profile. And there I've got the journal articles that I published, which include 3 on this topic. If people just want to connect with me, I'm available on Facebook, and you can email me at chrisdate@rethinkinghell.com. And I'm super accessible, and I love talking about stuff with people who are interested in talking about it in a respectful manner. So,
Great.
I guess I'll leave you guys with that.
Before we let you go, there may be people that are listening to this program, and because this is a problematic view for some people, they think, well, yeah, hey, Braxton, you didn't really push back on this issue. And I just want to say this, and I'm probably on a slightly different track than Chris on this. I don't know that he would agree with what I'm about to say or this approach to it, but I've been an evangelistic preacher for years, but for a long time, because I wanted to be faithful to the truth, if there's a chance at all that I'm wrong about this issue, as we said earlier, you want to be open about that. And I think that should go on the other side as well. And so for those of you, when you preach evangelistic messages, or if you ever touch on hell in preaching through the Bible, and I'm talking about Gehenna hell, then what I would say is you come to some place like Mark chapter 9 or something like that, verses 54 and following, I think it is, or something like that. Am I right, Chris?
43 and following.
43 and following. Yeah, it's good to have him around. But whenever you come to those passages, just read what Jesus says. No one can fault you for reading the words of Jesus, explaining them as best you understand the context and the cultural context and what he might be referring back to and all those kind of things. But then saying, what I've done for years is to say, look, here's what the Bible says about this. Now, could it be that this should be understood differently? And you may even run over those things a little bit. Say, but whatever the case may be, the Bible is clear that this is a bad thing. This is not something you want to have anything to do with. And I think for those that are uncertain or not sure about it, just laying both of those options out there, and I can tell you this is a bit of an encouragement. I've been doing that for more than 10 years now when I preach, and I've never once had anybody, even in the most conservative churches, I've never had anybody call me out for it or say, you're leaving the door open for some sort of weird heretical thing or a liberal thing. I've never had any of that. So I think that there's more of an acceptability as long as you're being open. Here, there's a couple of views at least that I want to present you on this. I think people are open to that.
You normally just say whatever your view of hell is, it's bad.
Yeah,
you know,
don't go there. But listen, Chris, we've really enjoyed having you on here, and we do have a great deal of affection for you. And listen,
the feeling's mutual.
And I appreciate that. And for those out there that maybe you don't like the ministry that Chris is involved in, you can at least appreciate that he brings a level of civility and is a model of how these theological debates and discussions should be done. And I have no question that he's an incredibly godly man. And so we're gonna pray for you and all that you do going forward. And listen, we're excited to see what Dr. Pritchett will present at this conference coming up. And hopefully we won't have to issue.
Train wreck,
hopefully we won't have to issue any apology videos.
Right. You probably will.
But thanks so much, Chris. And listen, everyone else, check out our sister podcasts, The Bible Brodown and Soteriology 101, and Steve Gregg's The Narrow Path. And Chris, any final thoughts?
No, it was a pleasure and an honor being here. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes.
All right, and we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.